My name is Richard Smith, and welcome everybody to this Harquail School of Earth Sciences Symposium. This year I'm the chair of the CSEG Distinguished Lecture Committee, and in that capacity, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you our speaker today, who is Paul Bauman. And Paul has been selected by the CSEG Foundation to be the distinguished lecturer representing the Canadian Society of Exploration Geophysicists. Paul received an undergraduate degree in geological engineering from Princeton University, and then he came to Canada to study at Waterloo, where he got a degree in hydrogeology. And since then, he's been working in near surface geophysics, a lot of which involves using geophysics to look for water. And today he's going to be talking to us about some humanitarian applications of looking for water. In particular, he's going to be talking about some refugee camps. And there's a connection with one of these refugee camps and Laurentian University. Some of you might remember Deng Deng, who did a master's degree, finishing in 2014 here at Laurentian. He did some of the modular courses, so you might have met him in those courses. Anyway, Deng spent 10 years at one of the refugee camps, mostly as a boy, doing his primary and high school, but then later he came back to the refugee camps to teach high school. So there is some interest in this talk to Deng and the connection with Laurentian. Anyway, Paul, I'll pass it over to you. So we look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I'm coming to you from a one-room cabin in the East Kootenays here, and there was a iPad going off in the background. I just had to get rid of that. But yeah, I certainly appreciate everybody logging in for this lecture. I imagine at this stage in the pandemic, many people, if not most people, are a bit zoomed out. So I certainly hope to make this worth your while. I want to express my appreciation right away to the CSEG Foundation and to Richard Smith for hosting me. And yeah, I'll be beginning early on. Speaking about the Kuma refugee camp, but moving to some other places. But hopefully, one thing you'll get out of this talk is what gargantuan feat it is to come out of a place like that and make it to a place like where you are now, or even to make it to Canada at all. And where we're going to begin in this talk is what for me was the beginning of my career and my interest in hydrogeology and geophysics. After my junior year at Princeton University in 1979, the winter of 1979, I took a year off. I knew I was interested in geosciences, but I did not know it at that point. I did not know what direction I wanted to go in the geoscience, whether it was marine geology, building dams, whatever. And so I took a year off and I spent it in the Sinai Peninsula between Israel and Egypt. And I got a number of different internships working on marine geology, geological mapping. And for 2 months, I worked on a geological mapping project on metamorphic geology in the Sinai Peninsula. And what most impressed me in that 2 months in the desert was not the structural geology of the Sinai, which is astounding, of course, was not the metamorphics or the fantastic and young igneous batholiths. It was the Bedouins and their ability, without a geological engineering degree from Princeton, without any education at all, to reliably and confidently site water wells. And I mentioned this to the lead geologist on this mapping project, Dr. Larry Gaber, and after we completed the project, he gave me this paper from the Israeli Geological Survey, their hydrogeology division in 1979, just before I went out there. Actually, they had carried out geophysical surveys, which you see a page from that paper on the right. And what the Bedouins did with intuitive knowledge, with traditional knowledge, how they were able to identify some for instance, the red dikes that were highly weathered that they could dig wells into, and the black dikes that were unweathered and would form underground dams in the wadis, and they could look at the lay of the land and see how where the wadi fill was deepest, and they knew where to dig alluvium. All those things that they did intuitively with traditional knowledge, the Geological Survey put some science to it with what then, this is 40 years ago, then was very basic resistivity and basic seismic refraction methods. And this absolutely captured my imagination. I knew I would never be a shaman. I knew I would never be a water diviner, but this seemed like a fascinating and great path to take in geophysics and near surface geophysical exploration. And that's what really set me on my course to where I am today. And I am having a little trouble advancing my slide screen. There we go. So, of course, over 40 years, I've had some amazing experiences and got to go to some fascinating places. One of those places where I've been, where I share that experience with Deng, of course, from who went to Laurentian, but I also share that experience going to the same place with two people much more famous than me, Angelina Jolie and Reese Witherspoon. But of those three people, Angelina Jolie, Reese Witherspoon, and myself, only two of us have made a movie there. And Reese Witherspoon, of course, she made the very good Hollywood movie. I would recommend it, The Good Lie. It actually uses a lot of Kakuma refugees and sons and daughters of refugees as actors. And of course, the other person that made a movie there was myself. In 2016, we carried out a water exploration program at the Kakuma camp, and that's what I'll be speaking about. And a short documentary was made of our program called Finding Water. But we'll come back to Angelina Jolie and later. The Kakuma refugee camp, it's in the northwest corner of Kenya in the Turkana Desert. And of course, today there are about 26 million refugees in the world, but if you take asylum seekers, internally displaced people, refugees that don't have official refugee status, you're actually at a number of about 80 million people. And while if we listen to various governments, you think refugees are flooding Switzerland and Canada and the United States, but they're not. Generally, refugees are fleeing impoverished, drought-stricken, war-ridden countries, usually arid countries under climate stress, and they're walking to adjacent countries that are equally poor and desperate and arid as well. And Kenya, which has 500,000 refugees, in fact, is the country with the 5th largest number of refugees in the world. And about half of those refugees in Kenya are in this camp, the Kakuma camp. The other half are in the Dadaab camp in the east. And in Kakuma, the refugees come from about 19 different countries, with 60% or so fleeing the civil war in South Sudan, 20% fleeing drought, civil war, famine, and Somalia, and the rest from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Yemen, so forth, fleeing civil war, drought, famine, climate change. The camp was established in 1992 when the Lost Boys, and they were largely boys, on between 6 and 16, walked for 1, 2, 3 years out of South Sudan across the swamps, deserts, and into Ethiopia. And then they fled civil war in Ethiopia and came to the Kenyan border. And then from there, they were trucked and bused and helicoptered 100 kilometers south of the border to the middle of nowhere, to the middle of the desert. And there they established the first camp, Kakuma 1. As the camp expanded, the camp was built for 70,000. Today it's at 200,000, expanded to Kakuma 2, Kakuma 3. And here you see Kakuma 4 from a drone photograph I took in 2017. So on the left, we have a simplified geological map of Kenya. And you'll notice on the left side of that, there's a rough lineament going from south to north. And that peach-colored lineament, that's the east arm of the East African Rift Valley. So that's largely volcanics. in the spreading Rift Valley. You'll see Kakuma is at the top of that lineament, but it's also at the bottom. Not sure how well my mouse will work here for you, but it's at the bottom of that blue semicircle. And what you have there is the volcanics form a bit of a dish, a shallow basin. And Kakuma is on the southern end of that basin. It's called the Lotikippy Basin. It's infilled with sediment being, of course, clay, silt, sand, but also a lot of inland salt deposits from the inland inland lakes that would have developed. And the rock, the volcanics, because it's at the edge of the rim, they sometimes outcrop. There's volcanics sometimes a meter or so beneath the surface. There's sometimes several tens of meters. And when we carried out our 2016 water exploration program, at that point in the life of the camp, all 12 wells producing water for the camp, the entire water supply came from those 12 wells. They were all screened in volcanics, as had been the practice of the UN since the establishment of the camp in 1992. So they all produced from weathered volcanics, variable water flows, although they all produce water with fluoride concentrations at or above or way above the Kenyan and World Health Organization guidelines for fluoride, which is the same as Canada, 1.5 milligrams per liter. From those wells, the water is then pumped for 10 hours every night. It's chlorinated, and then it's stored in these large 1,000 cubic meter overhead tank. And then the next morning, from those overhead tanks, water is fed for a few hours by gravity to tap stands, hundreds of tap stands around the camp, and the same is done in the evening. So the water flows, maybe, sometimes it works, sometimes doesn't. People line up early morning hours to get water, mostly young people, mostly young girls, hoping to get water, hoping the taps will run, hoping they won't get raped or physically abused, hoping that they might get water in time before allowing them to go home, cook for their families, and then get to school. So as you can imagine, they often give up. They're often afraid to wait in these lines. So they'll go out into the lagers, the dry riverbeds, the Turkana word for dry riverbeds. And they're the young refugee children, they'll dig these scoop holes and they'll scoop out water that, of course, is not chlorinated. It's high in E. coli and pathogens. And as bad as the water situation is for the refugees in the camp, it's even worse for the host community, as they say in NGO speak, the Turkana, who are semi-nomadic pastoralists whose lives largely revolve around taking their herds of goats, camels, and donkeys from one ephemeral water source to another. So I had been in the camp in 2014 and again in 2015. I was teaching a course to refugees and Turkana, about 40 people in each class. I was teaching a course on an introduction to groundwater and an introduction to exploration geophysics, specifically using resistivity, which I felt would be which is widely used in Kenya. And after spending time in the camp for both 2014 and 2015, I got a pretty intimate look at the water supply in the camp. And I realized it was not good enough, neither in the terms of the quantity of water, nor the quality of the water, particularly because of fluoride, but also because of salinity. So I thought, I wasn't sure, but I thought I could do better. I could put together an exploration program, and potentially I could use the students from these previous classes. So I got a grant from the CSEG, from Geoscientists Without Borders. And in 2016, I went back to the camp and I used 36 students from these previous classes and a few colleagues from Canada. We mounted a only two week exploration program in the Kakuma refugee camp. And before I show you I discuss the geophysics, I'll introduce to just a couple of the participants in the program. So this first one is Loki Lowy, and she's a Turkana woman. She's actually a teacher at the Angelina Jolie School, and that school was established by Angelina Jolie And it provides an alternative to young girls, a boarding school, an alternative to early childhood marriage, or an alternative to not going to school and having to stay in the refugee huts, cooking, gathering firewood, tending to the family. Like all the students in this class, every student, she spoke at least 3 languages. She spoke Turkana, English, and Kiswahili. Laban Lasuro, he was a refugee from South Sudan. He was actually a child soldier. He spoke 4 different languages. And as you can see, he was very good with a machete, which actually came in quite handy during our exploration program. Junior Kayembe, he was 3 years into a geology degree in the Congo when Civil War broke out. And he ended up walking and hitchhiking over 1,000 kilometers to get to Kakuma. And he actually speaks 5 languages, at least 5 languages. And he actually received 3rd country repatriation, is now a translator in North Carolina. That's a few people from my crew. You can see they're varied. They certainly weren't all goat herders and sheep herders. And some might characterize refugees. And what was our strategy? Well, our strategy was pretty simple. Since 1992, the UN had always targeted these weathered volcanics which exist at depths from a few tens of meters to up to 120 meters depth. And I thought, instead of looking deep, we're going to look shallow. Let's look for paleo channels, sand and gravel channels that are connected to these large lagas that bracket the camp, these large wadis, so Laga Tarash and Laga Nabak. Here we're looking down at Kakuma 1. You can see it contrasts sharply with Kakuma 4 because it's the older established part of the camp. And in fact, Deng lived in Kakuma 1. And my thinking was, if these paleo channels exist, and if we can find them, they'll be less expensive to drill, they'll be shallower, the water flows will be higher, and hopefully there'll be lower fluoride concentrations because the fluoride is largely leaching out of the calcium fluoride in the weathered volcanics. So you can see we have a good approach here, except there's no water in these lagas. They're dry, as you can see in this picture. But I knew from having been there in 2014, 2015, in the fall, when the rains come in Kakuma and in Uganda, further up the watershed, I knew that, as you see on the top left, if you get enough precipitation consistently for a few days, you start to accumulate water in the lagas and you get flash floods that'll go for days and even a couple weeks, as you see in the photo on the right. And I knew from the limited amount of monitoring data and existing water wells that these volcanics, the wells charge immediately, recharge immediately during these flash floods. So I assumed, I hoped, I speculated that if the volcanics would recharge immediately, then the alluvial gravels, if they existed, if we could find them, they would also recharge immediately. So the tactical approach using geophysics was very, very simple. We used 2 methods. First, we used seismic refraction, which of course measures the velocity of the subsurface. And the idea is quite simple, that bedrock is fast and overburden, whether it's alluvium or clay, is slow. So the refraction would define the top of bedrock, and we would use refraction to identify where the bedrock was deepest, where the overburden was thickest. And we collected 8 kilometers of refraction data. And then we used 2D resistivity tomography to determine whether that overburden material was clay-filled and conductive, or saltwater saturated sands and conductive, or whether it was freshwater saturated sands and gravels and resistive. So here you see one of our sections, an 800 meter section, what became known as our North well field. And here you can see in the red dashed line, that's our top of bedrock, 2,000 meters per second, as determined by seismic refraction. And then above that, we see our overburden. We see the hot pink resistor essentially blanketing the entire section. Variable thickness, but at least 20 meters thick. So this became the first target for drilling that the UN followed up on our data. They drilled the well there, Lucky Borehole 13, screened from 14 to 29 meters, screened only in the overburden in the alluvium, one of the shallowest wells ever drilled in Kakuma. It was also one of the highest producing wells ever drilled in Kakuma at 40 cubic meters an hour, and it was the first well ever drilled in Kakuma that had fluoride concentrations within drinking water limits at 0.9 milligrams per liter. The UN then followed up with 2 additional wells in similar sand bodies, and those were also high producers at 29, 45 cubic meters per hour, also with low fluoride concentrations within drinking water limits. And so what do those flows mean? Well, at 10 hours, pumping for 10 hours a day at night at those flow rates, given that the UN targets 20 liters per person per day for water supply in the camp, that's enough water from those 3 wells for 60,000 refugees. So I think everybody listening in on this talk, I think you can probably all agree with me that finding water for refugees, 200,000 refugees plopped in the middle of the desert, is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing controversial with that. But how important really is it in the middle of the desert, whether the fluoride concentrations of 0.6 milligrams per liter, 1.6 or 6? Does it really matter? Is it just a guideline? Well, in 2018 and 2019, for the first time in the history of the camp, a small NGO, an Israeli NGO, Israel, that also provided on my program some logistical support. They supplied a 1-week dental clinic in the camp. And the dentists, of course, as you can imagine, after 25 years with no dental care, they just saw the worst cases. And each week they carried out about 200 dental extractions. And the dentist told me that each of those years of the 200 extractions, 70% of those extractions were directly due to dental fluorosis. And of course, at higher concentrations, you can get skeletal fluorosis, crippling skeletal fluorosis as well. So that there's a water scarcity in a refugee camp in the desert probably doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. But on the left, what we're looking at here, this is satellite data from the GRACE satellite, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Exchange climate experiment. It's actually 2 satellites. Those GRACE satellites, they measure changes of gravity in the Earth, and what causes gravity depletion are 2 things: loss of ice and loss of groundwater. And what we see here is a gravity low over northern India, but we also see a gravity low over parts of Bangladesh. And as even if you've never been to Bangladesh, you know there's a lot of water in Bangladesh. It rains a lot. The rainfall in Bangladesh, particularly in the southeast of Bangladesh, in the area I'll be talking, the Teknaf Peninsula, to which the arrow points, the rainfall there is 3.8 meters a year. That's twice the rainfall of Squamish. In fact, Bangladesh receives 50 billion cubic meters of groundwater recharge everywhere, but extracts 53 billion. So there's a overdraft. And although the southeast part of Bangladesh receives a lot of precipitation, and until 2017 it was largely unpopulated, it's mostly jungle. In 2017, of course, following and during the Rohingya crisis, the genocide and ethnic cleansing going on in Myanmar, over 1 million Rohingya refugees walked and boated and floated across from Myanmar into the Teknaf Peninsula. And needless to say, these refugees needed water. So given our success in Kakuma, UNHCR invited us to do a water exploration program in the Teknaf Peninsula at 4 of the camps, including the later and Nayapara camps in the south, the Kutupalong camps in the north. In fact, we did have success. The Kutupalong camp, we found many sand channels, and in the Nayapara and later camps, we found these sandstone outliers, and wells were drilled and they did produce water, but not nearly enough water to supply the immediate needs over the large area in which these 1 million refugees settled. So what also happened behind the UN's effort, there were probably well over 100 NGOs, religious organizations, various volunteer agencies working in that area. And they're, without geological knowledge, without scientific planning, without really any kind of coordination, they just went crazy, drilling shallow water wells down to 5-8 meters everywhere, including, for instance, in this picture, as in this picture, very typical scenario where one well is drilled immediately next to another well. So there's two consequences, a number of consequences are this. One is these thousands of shallow individual wells. You have no chlorination, no treatment of the water. Secondly, of course, with so many wells, so many tightly spaced, come the dry season, they all run dry. And thirdly, with no planning and no geological knowledge, what you see here is two wells on the right, and they're completely crowded and surrounded by clusters of latrines, showers, and runoff of human waste coming down these gullies. So in fact, a terrible situation in terms of WASH, what, and again, in NGO speak, is water sanitation hygiene situation. So I have to say, somewhat discouraged, and I'd say even demoralized by the scenario I saw in this immediate and chaotic humanitarian response. I wanted to do another program, my own humanitarian groundwater action, but I decided to do my next one in a place where, in fact, there weren't NGOs, there wasn't any UN involvement. Indeed, there was very little government involvement of any kind. So in January of 2018, again, with a grant from Geoscientists Without Borders, I conceived, put together a plan, and carried out another 2-week water exploration program in northern Uganda in an area called Acholi land. And here, from early 1980s, 1982 to until 2006, 2007 or so, Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army prosecuted what became Africa's longest running civil war. And the Ugandan government, who never had any love, particularly for the Acholi people of the north, essentially used the civil war as an excuse to clear the land of the Acholi people and take the 1.8 million Acholi people off the land and put them into 251 camps, what were essentially concentration camps. And these camps had horrible health conditions with the highest mortality rates in the world, over 1,000 people dying, the highest Ebola concentration, the biggest Ebola outbreaks in the world, high concentrations of AIDS, cholera, trachoma, malaria, and so forth. By 2006, 2007, the war began winding down, and families started to return to their village. But by families at this point, it was largely older women and younger children. Very few young men were left. Most had either been killed or died or been taken off as child soldiers. Of course, these families, they had to rebuild their gardens, they had to rebuild their homes, and they had to restore their water supplies. So where are we? So we started this talk in Kakuma, in the east arm of the East African Rift Valley. And now we haven't actually moved that far away. We moved just a few hundred kilometers to the west, but we've come out of the Rift Valley onto type of geology that essentially characterizes about half of Africa, the African crystalline basement, which isn't all that different from the Canadian Shield, where of course Sudbury is. Of course, the biggest difference is the African crystalline basement has not been glaciated. Gulu is the largest city in Acholi land. And so where do we find water in these massive crystalline basement structures? Well, I had a pretty good idea, because in 1999, 2000, myself and a colleague, Dr. Richard Kellett, we put together and carried out a water exploration program where we sited 450 water wells in the Rift Valley and the crystalline basement of southeast Malawi for the German Development Bank. And before just jumping into this program with a methodology, we first carried out a borehole geophysical program to figure out what methodology we should use. So we first identified 20 or so water wells where they'd been good producing wells for a long time, but they were no longer functioning because of mechanical failure in the pumps. So we pulled the hand pumps, pulled the pipe down the hole, and repaired the pumps. But while the pumps were out of the hole, we logged those boreholes with natural gamma log, borehole conductivity, induction conductivity, and magnetic susceptibility. And the idea was to see what physical property best characterizes the aquifers. So what are the aquifers in these crystalline basement areas? Well, much of the world, much of Africa, people look for the fractured jointed rock. But my strategy was not to look for these joint sets because they can produce a lot of water but dry out very quickly, but look for the more extensive saprolite zones. And saprolite is weathered crystalline rock. It looks like rock, it smells like rock, it has all the grain, the texture of granite or gneiss or diorite or whatever that crystalline rock might be, but it's been chemically weathered where the soluble minerals have been removed. And if the terrain is in areas of high enough precipitation, that porosity will be water saturated. And as you can see in these logs, the borehole conductivity log best characterizes the saprolite. The saprolite is uniquely high in conductivity, the saturated saprolite. And so therefore that opens up an array of electrical geoelectric methods. And the best technique we used in that Malawi program was 2D resistivity. So that's what we used in our Uganda program. And again, in Uganda, in Acholi then, I taught 2 courses in 2015 and 2017. I taught 2 2-week courses to Acholi people. They were either returning child soldiers or returnees that had grown up and come back to their villages out of the camps. I trained them in water exploration using 1D resistivity methods, hand pump repair, manual drilling techniques, and field water chemistry. So it was quite easy to introduce them and get them going on 2D resistivity, because they already had this basic, or at least this practical, and this very practical field understanding and modeling, and 1D inversion modeling of 1D resistivity. So we carried out a 2D resistivity exploration program in 2 weeks, targeting 20 villages. And here's a typical section on the top, 500 meters across, 67 meters deep. And what you see on the right is the high resistivities of massive rock extending right to surface. But on the left, you see those low resistivities, that is high conductivities of our weathered crystalline rock, our saprolite. That's our saprolite aquifer, extends to maybe 30 meters, no trace of it on the surface, but very clear in the geophysics. With these manual techniques, you can easily drill down to 25 or 30 meters. Now, myself and my colleagues, Canadian colleagues, we were there for the exploration program. But at this point, 2018, the Acholi people, they knew more about manual drilling and hand pump installation than I did. So the drilling and the installation came after the geophysics. But of course, we wanted to make sure that the holes were put in the right place. So every site we carried out exploration, we did drone imagery, we created orthomosaic photographs, we did the interpretations with the Acholi people, sited the wells, as you see here, gave them the photos. So they knew precisely, without any question, without any possibility of confusion from datums or GIS locations or whatever, they knew exactly where to drill these wells. And this is how it's done. In 2 or 3 days, you can drill down through saprolite, through crystalline basement, you can drill down with manual methods to 25, 30 meters depth. Now, not all the sections were quite as simple as that previous section. Here's a section 500 meters across, again, looking about 60, 70 meters deep. In the top layer, we have this hot resistor, pink resistor, very typical. That's the brick red lateritic, baked lateritic clays that you see all across Africa and tropical zones. In the bottom, you see the high resistivities of the massive crystalline rock. But then you see bisecting, immediately splitting this section, we have a dike, an impermeable dike, kind of analogous to those dikes that those Bedouin shamans, traditional knowledge water explorers mapped. And you can see to the left on the west side, the resistivities are higher, likely unsaturated. On the right, the resistivities are lower, saturated. Here's a diagram of the scenario we envision. You can see that the dike is essentially acting as an underground dam, with the water table rising on the left side and lowering on the right side. So is that a theory or a fact? Well, again, a well was drilled by manual methods. The Acholi people here, they are installing the rising main that goes down to the piston, the cylinder that's in front of the screens at the bottom. And then before we carry on further work, we pump the well a bit, collect some water, do some field water chemistry, and we actually did laboratory water analyses of all the water samples. Of course, it's important not just to provide water, but to provide good quality water. And then the pump head is installed and a nice, clean, neat concrete and brick apron is made. And that's very important to make sure there's proper drainage, keep the mosquitoes down, keep malaria, dengue, and Zika down. And the job is done. And a nice well that should last at least 5 years, if not longer, is installed. So that was in northern Uganda, working in 2018. Now, from being up on the northern Uganda border, and especially from my experience in the Kakuma refugee camp, of course, I'd met many South Sudanese refugees, and I'd heard many horror stories about life in South Sudan during the world's youngest country that suffered through a brutal civil war between the Nuer and Dinka people. And I can tell you, certainly South Sudan was one of those countries between civil war and landmine and the just general violence that I knew I would never go to personally. But in October 2019, that is last fall, International Committee of the Red Cross contacted me. There was not a peace, not a truce, but a brief cessation of hostility in the epicenter of the civil war in Jonglei State, and it offered an opportunity for the Red Cross to go deep into some of the areas of the thick of the Civil War, rebel-controlled territories that have been cut off from water supplies, cut off from any type of aid. And they wanted to know if I would assist, if I would lead a water exploration program. And given my commitment to never go to South Sudan, of course, I said, sure. So in November, early November, I flew to Juba, the capital. And here we're looking at a simplified geological map of South Sudan. You can see the southern part, the Tope area, is an extension of the crystalline basement north from northern Uganda, from the Central African Republic. And then as we move north from the crystalline basement, we move into this yellow area. And this is a broad, flat wetland, the largest wetland in the world, called the Sud. It's actually larger than the area of the entire province of Nova Scotia. And there I based my work out of two villages of Hat and Chul. So I flew for 3 hours from Juba over the Sud wetland, and it was not only, of course, is it a wetland, but it was undergoing a catastrophic floods that year that beyond the Civil War were engendering other humanitarian crises. And I actually found it darkly humorous that when I returned from South Sudan early December, I saw this trending news feature in BBC, and I received a number of emails from colleagues that were at the American Geophysical Union meeting in San Francisco that year, where a paper had been presented identifying the unmodeled, unpredicted small increases in the world methane concentration as being due to the increased flooding, the pulse of methane coming from the flooding in South Sudan. And why I found this darkly humorous is, for me, having just come back from there, this was not the story. This was not even a story. A few parts per million methane in the atmosphere. The story, the unreported story, was over 1 million internally displaced persons, refugees, famine, war, a an upsurge in cholera, malaria, trachoma, waterborne diseases, a tragedy of catastrophic proportions. This was the only story worth reporting. So here's a typical village, one of the 20 or so villages I visited. I took this image from a drone photograph. And again, all these villages, I did do drone imagery, so water wells could be precisely targeted without requiring any fancy GPS or risking confusion on datums or any other sources of confusion. And one thing you'll probably see immediately here is there's lots of water. Now granted, this is the dry season. I mean, there's the wet season. We are in flood, but these are so it is bracketed by tributaries of the Nile River. But there's no sanitation here. It's open defecation. There's even latrines are rare, and there's open grazing. All the water sources are full of E. coli and lots of other pathogens. And the water sources, in fact, especially in the dry season, they're actually not so easy to access. So really, groundwater is the only safe and stable and sustainable resource that people can have available to them. So what did we do? We established our 2 camps in small villages, and our camps is very flattering. These are a small pop tent where we would cook over a fire, buy local food, eating under mosquito nets. And every day we would either hike out using women, female porters. These are the women from Hat carrying, they look like the weights to light. These are very heavy loads. These are batteries, electronics, cables, stainless steel electrodes. Hike across through the swamps, through knee-deep mud, through waist-high grass, mosquitoes, through 45, 50-degree heat. Hike out to the various villages, and the further lying villages, the ICRC supported me with boats. And I cannot speak high enough about the incredible logistical support that the Red Cross gave me during this program. And there at these villages, we would do 2D resistivity over this vast wetland, which is poorly mapped, but is broadly mapped as indeterminate thicknesses of quaternary materials and quaternary materials. And of course, the first few sections, unfortunately, the first few sections, we simply saw clay. The highest resistivity here you can see is 6 ohm meters. As we carried on, though, we were able to identify in many locations, most locations, these shallow, what we interpret as sand and gravel channels, always shallow, always within 10, 20 meters of the surface, easily drilled by manual methods or hand dug wells. And the Red Cross will be following up as soon as the pandemic subsides. Finally, on my way out of South Sudan, I did spend 10 days in Juba, the capital. Juba is the only capital city in the world, I believe, without a reticulated water system, without any water sanitation system, without even an electric grid system. What we're looking at here is from the fall of 5 months in 2018, we're looking at a map of what the South Sudanese call waterborne disease outbreaks, but that's essentially cholera. And the light colored areas are low numbers of outbreaks, dark colored areas are high number of outbreaks. And so what I did, of course, was target those neighborhoods within Juba with the high number of outbreaks, because we know that infectious disease outbreaks have an inverse correlation with the availability of water. As a final geophysical section, I'll show you across this well, and believe it or not, this is in the heart of central Juba. This well was certainly likely drilled by an NGO because it's at the intersection of 2 major streets. And anyone out there, including myself, would look at this well placement and say it's the most ridiculous, silly well placement because it's drilled right into the massive rock, crystalline rock, and the chances of getting any water are 0. But in fact, this has been a long producing well, a sustainable well. It occasionally goes dry in the dry season, long lineups of people waiting for well. And what looks like rock, massive rock, is not rock. And the geophysics tells us the truth. We see here a thick blanket from 20 to 40 meters of weathered crystalline rock, the blue. If you can see that well we just looked at, the hand pump is screened in a 20-meter thick zone of saprolite. But we also see that this section is sited an even better target that at the least will provide a second well. It's about 100 meters away, but at best it will provide another 20 meters of drawdown, which could be especially valuable in the dry season. This geophysics stuff really works. So finally, in conclusion, we're going to go to Indonesia. We're going to go back to 2005 to the Indian Ocean tsunami, Boxing Day tsunami in Aceh. I speak Indonesian, I speak Malay. My training is in hydrogeology and geophysics. UNICEF, following the tsunami, seconded me, asked me to assess the impact of the tsunami to Aceh province, the epicenter of the tsunami and earthquake, and begin the redevelopment of water supplies there. And I took this photograph. I took it from this is in the days before drones. I took it from a system I built of a camera suspended from a kite. Fantastic photo. We're looking at this tugboat that was pulling this coal barge from Palembang in South Sumatra to Singapore. The tsunami wave lifted it up and dropped it onto the coastal plain. But that's not why I took the photo. The reason I took the photo is the denuded cliff in the background. This is the first place that US Geological Survey scientists came to Aceh following the tsunami because they wanted to measure the height of the tsunami wave. And here it was 31 meters. The tsunami wave completely inundated the coastal plain of Aceh, reaching as far inland as 5 kilometers. And of course, there was a similar scenario all around the Indian Ocean. In Aceh, there were over 200,000 hand-dug wells that were inundated. And what I saw in my response was hundreds of NGOs with thousands of volunteers coming into Aceh and all around the Indian Ocean with hand pumps, mechanical pumps, pumping out these inundated saltwater wells of salt water and various organic waste in those wells, further drawing in the saltwater intrusion front, dumping that salt water back onto the landscape immediately next to the well, pumping it back into the well, and usually ending up with a complete collapse of the well. And the thought I want to leave you here in conclusion is that in these humanitarian crises that are ongoing and that we're certainly going to get in the future, climate change, from drought, from famine, from war, from earthquakes, of course, there's tremendous financial need, there's tremendous human need, there's tremendous need for food and various resources. But usually, and often, and perhaps all the time, there's also a need for good science, and very often a need for good geoscience. So I'm hoping, I'm leaving, especially with people, undergrads, sitting and struggling to keep their heads from nodding off as they're spending hours looking into their petrology microscopes or maybe trying to see the practical aspects of field school, that you realize, in fact, there are some very practical and important things you can do with a geoscience background. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the CSEG Foundation, Geoscientists Without Borders, who supported the Kakuma and Uganda projects, Kakuma refugees, Turkana, Acholi crews, Canadians who helped carry out those projects, ISRAID, who and UNHCR provided logistical support, and ICRC and Groundwater Relief, who provided logistical support in South Sudan. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions if there were. Thank you everybody who's out there on Zoom.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And I should just mention as well too, while I have a chance, that the CSEG Foundation offers scholarships to students that are interested in earth science and geophysics in particular. So if you're interested in applying to the CSEG Foundation for a scholarship, then you can look on their website for that. Okay, so questions. You can type questions into the chat box. And you can unmute your microphone as well. So maybe if anyone has a question, they could do so.
And I can certainly say, people can ask me anything. I'm certainly open to any kind of question.
Well, I could start off with a question. One of the first resistivity profiles you showed a well, and you also, I saw off to the left a place where the bedrock was interpreted to be deeper and it was resistive above that area. And I wondered why that one wasn't chosen as the preferred well site.
Yeah, excellent question. And I think I'll go, well, excellent question, Richard. And I think I know the question. Bring that, I think it's this one.
Yes, that's right. So just above the L in the second fault from the left is a thicker zone where there's a local reduction.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. Yeah, I thought you meant the big plug to the left, which and actually first I'm going to give you a bigger picture. At this point we had left Kakuma, and UNHCR followed up with the drilling. They desperately needed these wells because there was a major expansion of the camp. So in the end, the precise locations of the wells were not chosen. And I guess in the interest of candor here, and since this isn't for UNHCR, and this has something to do with why I ended up going to Uganda, I'm going to tell you that initially UNHCR, that didn't particularly want us there at the time, said thank you very much, and they ignored all our data. And then they hired a Kenyan company to come in and do geophysics, and they did a bunch of 1D soundings. And UNHCR drilled that data, which I'd seen, and each of those wells drilled through 100 meters of clay. And finally, out of complete desperation, they came back to our data. Essentially not. I believe the attitude was, what the heck can these people know? We've been working here 25 years, and here they drop in for 2 weeks, and what can they possibly accomplish? And so this well was a complete game changer. And why exactly they drilled there versus at 300 meters, I don't know. I actually don't know, but I don't think it really matters that much either, because the sand is continuous. They would have been better off drilling at the deeper sand, because they would have got, even though it is a contiguous aquifer, they would have got greater drawdown. But I was very pleased that they did drill that sand. And another question you could ask was, well, it's screened at 14 at 29 meters, but clearly they drilled deeper. And fortunately, a professor from University of Neuchâtel who consults with the UN, she was out there, Dr. Ellen Milne, she was on the rig. And the drillers who drill all these wells, every well they drill, regardless of the geology, they drill 120 meters. And this well, they just kept ripping down, this is what she told me. And they got down to 60 meters. And she said, no. And that's it, stop. And they were gonna stop and screen. She said, no, we don't want to screen the volcanics, plug everything back. And they just couldn't understand it, but they did as she requested. They actually plugged the well back and just screened over that interval. And now this has become the practice. UN has gone on to drill 3 more wells, a total of 6 wells in these alluvial sections, and they've all been great producers. They've all had low fluoride concentrations.
Okay, thanks very much for answering that, Paul. That answers my question. Are there any other questions? I noticed there's some people on the chat box, Paul, that are saying, thank you very much for the presentation. It was fascinating and impressive. Good combination of humanitarian work and art and science. So we're getting good feedback.
So Richard, this is Peter Carey. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead,
Yeah,
Peter.
I'm here in Victoria, and I can talk, Paul.
Hi, Peter.
So you've mentioned, so you talked the full time about groundwater exploration. are your humanitarian efforts, are they always looking for groundwater, or do you all also do other things? And you mentioned using refraction, statics, and resistivity. Is that the full range of geophysical methods you've used?
Yeah, two questions there, and I'll answer them both. First, yeah, even Kakuma, seismic and resistivity were what we brought out there, but we also collected IP from the resistivity. We also processed IPA, hoping that we might help us differentiate, for instance, crystalline basement from volcanics, let's say, and then we also did some reflection processing, and we also processed for MASW, that is shear wave analysis, hoping that might give us some understanding of where the bedrock is fractured and jointed and where it isn't. So yeah, and we also looked at legacy aeromagnetic data. We looked at everything. Uganda, we did focus on resistivity methods. We did actually bring a borehole system there, but it got lost in the airport in Holland. But really relying on the borehole more to supplement the science, not so much for targeting the water wells. But you saw in Uganda, we also did the borehole geophysics was absolutely critical for us understanding what we were looking for identifying physical properties of interest. And I'd say in the bigger picture, borehole geophysics is hugely underutilized, especially in Africa, where all the boreholes are PVC case, so you really can do it. In terms of my humanitarian work, it's largely been divided into two completely different aspects. One is it's water exploration work, and I've done a lot of these projects. Usually I try to do one a year. And the other aspect is mass grave mapping, atrocity mapping, of which I've done a lot in Europe. And mostly Holocaust-related mass graves from World War II, but other mass graves as atrocity mapping as well. And the main techniques we've been using there have been ground-penetrating radar, magnetics, electromagnetics there, because it's so shallow. And we're looking for, the targets can vary. We're looking for metal, we're looking for pits. We're trying to delineate features in plan view. Yeah, a lot of drone imagery, drone multispectral imagery, drone magnetics. The techniques we've been using there have been wider. Also because there's more of a research element there. Those programs have been sponsored by universities. Well, of course, the science is important to these water supply projects, but boy, oh boy, with all the science, the big thing is to find water. I mean, these places are really humanitarian crises where people really need water, and the science is of use moving forward, but you have to come away with some success.
Thanks. So have you ever, in some of these politically sensitive areas, been in any danger of harm or feared for your life? Any such reason?
Yeah, I mean, actually, no. I can say I've never feared for my life, and yes, I've been in a number of active wars. I've been in one place where quite literally a war started. I came back from South Sudan. Yeah, I came back from South Sudan in December of this year, and I landed at the airport. My wife picked me up I had a talk at the Association of Professional Engineers in Edmonton the next day, a lunchtime talk. My wife picked me up, and at 2 in the morning, I woke up in horrific pain with my leg swollen the size of a tree trunk, and went to the emergency room at the hospital there, and still made my talk. And yeah, I've had people get dysentery and this and that. But no, I mean, generally, sure. I certainly don't go out of my way to go into places where the risks are severe. Having said what I just said, because basically the bottom line is, when you're on a project like this, for instance, in South Sudan, there's so much resources. We're going into this war zone. I mean, we're literally deep inside rebel-controlled territory. But if something happens to me through violence, I mean, not only is it bad for me, it's bad for the entire relief effort, for the Red Cross, for NGOs everywhere. I tell you, even while I was in Jonglei, 3 UN workers were killed. You know, things do happen, but I felt very well taken care of by the Red Cross. I can tell you they had no guns. Their entire philosophy is just go in with information and with good community relations, and they don't go in with guns, which is certainly my philosophy. You know, I make a huge point of keeping myself healthy, far more effort than I would normally if I was a tourist. You know, I'm super careful what I eat. I eat nothing rather than eat something dodgy. I don't eat anything fresh. Everything's cooked. I'm really careful about, you know, bug dope and this and that. And again, it's not because I'm super paranoid, but it's because I know if I get sick, I mean, the Red Cross, they put together this Bell 412 helicopter, 2 boats, organized supplies, you know, made this huge upfront effort on communication, logistical support. You know, these people are counting on this water. Like, it's really incumbent on me, my duty, no matter what I might care of my personal health, to make sure I stay healthy. So, I mean, yeah, I could regale you with various stories, but I can tell you 99.9% of the time when I'm there, no matter what's going on, the preparations in place, the logistical supports are there, that I can do what I have to do, which is really focus on the work. Because this work is technical. We need very precise answers. I have to stay healthy. I have to stay safe. I have to keep my crew safe, not only the Canadians, but also the, you know, the locals supporting us. So yeah, I can tell you some great stories, but health and safety is paramount, and there is noise going on in the background, stuff's happening, but nothing bad has really ever happened to me, at least in country.
Okay, thanks. So there are no questions on the chat. Are there any other questions from the audience? People want to unmute their microphone?
I can ask, Paul, you said you're going to come back to the Angelina Jolie story. Was there more to Angelina Jolie's story there?
Well, I mean, that's part of it. That just, I mean, what I found working there, you know, you see lots of movie stars and high profile people and even politicians, and even, you know, Canadian politicians. I mean, Bob Ray certainly had his photo opportunities in the Rohingya camps this last year, but Angelina Jolie actually, I mean, my impression while there, like the Angelina Jolie School was a fantastic ongoing effort that really worked. And Loki Lowy, a fantastic woman, Turkana woman, you know, that grew up in a grass hut in the desert, is a teacher there and is furthering her education in you know, by taking this course with me at the camp. But yes, there is more to the story. I just found out yesterday that Deng, who graduated who graduated with a master's degree, is now working as a mining geophysicist, graduated from Laurentian. He was in the camp for 10 years. And I can tell you, for anyone to get out of the camp is astounding. For anyone to get out of the camp, get an education, come to Canada, get a degree at U of T, get a master's in Sudbury at Laurentian, go on to be a geophysicist and a very competitive mechanologist, is an exceptional person. And he told me a little bit about himself, and he was an exceptional person. I mean, he excelled in everything he did, as a leader, as a student, as a teacher in the camp, and everything is a struggle there. I mean, just surviving is a struggle there. And because he was such a leader, when Angelina Jolie came to the camp, Deng was asked to, in 2007, 2008, to establish the camp, the school. he met with Angelina Jolie. He actually hosted her at there's actually a pretty famous restaurant within the camp that's run by refugees. It's called Franco's. It's an Ethiopian restaurant, and I think it's a bit overdone. I mean, because everyone's so amazed to find anything. I would say you have a 50-50 chance of getting sick if you eat there. But nevertheless, it's a great place to go for coffee. And she was hosted there by Deng. And the story goes on even more, which it's really Deng's story to tell, not mine. But as I understood him, his wife went to school there, to the camp, and she did very, very well there, and had a connection to the school, and at the time she wasn't his wife, but then eventually they got married, and of course both of them came to Canada, and I can tell you, Deng specifically noted that he had one of the highest marks year after year after year in the Kenyan exams, national exams at the camp, until his wife took the exams, and then her marks actually significantly exceeded her, which I can point out. He notes that this is something that certainly notable, given that South Sudanese, Dinka and Nuer society is a very traditional. Women largely enter marriage very early and gather firewood and cook, and there can be some very positive outcomes of these camps, including education.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Paul. I think that's probably a good note to end on. So we'll call an end to the seminar here, and thank everybody for that participation, and thank Paul also very much for his efforts in preparing and presenting this lecture. So normally we'd call for a round of applause now, but that's not so easy. But anyway, I'm sure that everybody agrees, because we've kept the participants up all the way to the end. So that was great. Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, thank you, Richard, and really thank everybody, because I know doing one more Zoom talk can often be the last thing that people want to do, especially at the end of the week. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.